No one, not a single soul, truly knows how Joshua Maddux's final journey came to an end. His last steps vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed them, or as if something unseen decided to take him away. Who did he meet that day? Where was he going? And what compelled him to step into a place from which there was no return? Was it just an unfortunate accident? Or was there something deeper, something far stranger, waiting to be discovered? And why him, of all people? Many questions have been asked, but each answer opens the door to more uncertainty. Yet the one question that continues to haunt everyone who has heard this story is, what choices could a rational person possibly make to end up inside a chimney? You are now listening to Sleeping Radio, where stories begin when the world goes to sleep. High in the state of Colorado, tucked away among mountains draped in endless pine forests, lies a small town called Woodland Park. It's the kind of place where time seems to move a little slower. The streets are winding, the houses are mostly made of timber, and in the early mornings, a mist rolls down from the mountains like a soft white blanket, covering everything in silence. Life here, for the most part, is quiet. There's the occasional hum of a pickup truck passing by, the chatter of neighbors exchanging greetings on their way to the local diner, and the steady whisper of the wind weaving its way through the trees. In winter, the snow falls thick and heavy, turning the town into a postcard scene. In summer, the smell of pine and earth fills the air, and the sound of distant birdsong carries from the forest. In this tranquil corner of the world lived a young man named Joshua Maddux. To those who knew him, Josh was more than just another face in the crowd. He was one of those rare souls who seemed at ease in almost any company. He had a gentle, warm nature, an easy smile that made people feel comfortable, and eyes that held a quiet spark. The kind of spark that hinted at dreams too big to be confined by a small-town life. Born in 1990, Joshua was part of a close-knit family. His parents raised him alongside his siblings in a modest home, surrounded by the same mountains and forests that had shaped generations before them. While his life wasn't without its share of challenges, as no life truly is, it was filled with the small comforts of familiarity. Josh loved music. He played the guitar, often sitting out on the porch as the sun dipped behind the mountains, strumming soft melodies that floated on the evening air. Sometimes he would write down his own thoughts in the form of songs or journals. Nothing he ever made a big deal about, just quiet expressions of the things he felt and observed. Friends remember him as someone with a free spirit. He enjoyed wandering through the forests around town, not always with a destination in mind, but simply for the sake of exploring. There was something about the quiet of nature that seemed to resonate with him. He wasn't restless exactly, but he carried that subtle curiosity, that pull toward the unknown, which sometimes draws a person beyond the boundaries of what's safe. Still, no one could have predicted that this same curiosity, or perhaps something else entirely, might lead him to the fate he would one day meet. The year was 2008, and Joshua was 18 years old. He had recently graduated high school and was in that uncertain, open-ended stage of life where everything felt possible, and nothing was set in stone. He talked about traveling, maybe going on a road trip, maybe heading somewhere warmer for a while. At the same time, he still felt tied to his hometown, to the people he cared about, and the familiar rhythm of life in Woodland Park. That spring, life in the Maddux household seemed normal enough. But beneath the surface, there was a lingering shadow, the kind of thing that shapes a family in ways outsiders rarely see. A few years earlier, Joshua's older brother had tragically passed away. It was a loss that left a mark on all of them. For Josh, it may have deepened that reflective, searching quality that people often noticed in him. On the morning of May 8, 2008, Joshua left home. It wasn't unusual for him to head out for a walk, sometimes disappearing for hours to roam the trails. But this time was different. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, and he never came back. At first, his family wasn't overly alarmed. After all, Josh was known for his independent streak. Maybe he had gone camping, or to visit a friend, or just needed some time to himself. But as the hours turned to days, and there was still no sign of him, worry began to settle in. Calls were made, friends were asked, flyers were printed, the local police got involved. But there was no trace, no footprints, no witnesses who had seen him after he left home. His bank account remained untouched. His phone went silent. It was as though Joshua had simply vanished into thin air. In a small town like Woodland Park, disappearances leave a deep ripple. People start talking, sharing theories over coffee at the diner, remembering little things they'd seen or heard. Some swore they had spotted him walking along the road that day. Others thought maybe he had gotten a ride out of town. But every lead fizzled out. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons changed, and still nothing. For his family, it was an open wound that refused to heal. For the town, it was a story that lingered in whispers. And somewhere out there, Joshua was gone, but not forgotten. What no one knew then, what no one could have imagined, was that the answer to Joshua's disappearance was not miles away in some distant city or deep within the mountains, but less than a mile from his own home. And it would take 7 years for that answer to be found. The first few weeks after Joshua's disappearance were filled with movement. Friends searched the wooded trails, calling his name through the thick green canopies. His family knocked on doors, passed out flyers, and sat up late into the night waiting for the phone to ring. There was still hope then. Hope that at any moment Josh might walk back into town, carrying some story about where he'd been and why he'd left without a word. But as weeks slipped into months, the rhythm of that hope began to change. The daily search parties became weekend ones. The flyers started to fade in the sunlight, their corners curling in the dry Colorado air. Police officers, at first confident they might find him, began to speak more cautiously. The words they used were softer now. If he returns, instead of when he returns. For Joshua's family, every day was a strange contradiction. On one hand, they couldn't give up. On the other, they had to keep living, going to work, paying bills, keeping food on the table. His absence was a constant presence in their home, an empty chair at dinner, a guitar leaning silently in the corner of his room. In a small town like Woodland Park, everyone knows everyone, and everyone knew Joshua's story. Strangers would stop his parents at the grocery store to ask if there was any news. Friends from school would tell stories about him, their voices caught somewhere between nostalgia and grief. The rumors never really stopped. Some people believed Josh had simply left, maybe hitchhiked out of town, chasing some adventure no one else knew about. Others whispered about darker possibilities, that he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that someone had hurt him, that the forest surrounding the town might be hiding secrets no one wanted to find. The truth was, the wilderness here could swallow a person whole. Vast pine forests stretched for miles in every direction. There were hidden ravines, swift rivers, and abandoned cabins left to rot in the shade of the mountains. Search parties could comb the woods for days and still miss something. It was easy to believe that whatever had happened to Joshua had been hidden by the land itself. Years passed. By the time 2010 came around, 2 full years had gone by without a single confirmed sighting. Police had chased every lead they could, from distant phone tips to supposed sightings in nearby towns, but none of them led anywhere. His case remained open but cold. A file that sat in the department's drawer, occasionally pulled out when a new idea struck, but otherwise gathering dust. His family learned to live with the not knowing. That was the hardest part. Not grief, exactly, because grief comes with answers. This was a different kind of weight, a constant question mark, heavy and sharp, that followed them through every ordinary day. By 2013, 5 years had passed. In the quiet moments, the hope that Josh might come home had grown thinner. Time does that. It blurs the edges of memories, softens voices, makes the image of a missing face harder to hold. But even then, his parents refused to declare him gone. Somewhere, they believed, he could still be alive. The days leading up to May 8th, 2008 in Woodland Park were ordinary, at least on the surface. Spring had settled into the mountains, melting away the last stubborn patches of snow. The air was cool but no longer biting, and the scent of pine sap hung in the breeze. For most people in town, life was moving along in its usual rhythm. Children riding bikes after school, shopkeepers sweeping their doorways, and the occasional tourist passing through on their way to the more famous destinations deeper in Colorado. For Joshua Maddux, those early May days were much the same as any other. He still spent time at home, still picked up his guitar in the evenings, still wandered into town from time to see friends. There was nothing in his demeanor, no strange words or sudden changes to suggest that something unusual was coming. But hindsight has a way of coloring the past. After his disappearance, people replayed those last days in their minds, searching for meaning in moments that once seemed insignificant. It began like any other morning. The Maddux home was quiet. Joshua got up, dressed casually, and stepped out into the cool air without telling anyone exactly where he was headed. This wasn't unusual for him. He enjoyed long walks, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time to wander the trails that wound through the forests and hills. He didn't take a backpack. He didn't carry much with him. Just the clothes he was wearing, his wallet, and the ease of someone who expected to be back later that day. Some neighbors recall seeing him walking along the road that morning. He seemed calm, unhurried, and alone. One person thought they saw him heading toward the edge of town where the forest thickened, but no one could say for sure. And then, nothing. The weather that day was mild, the sky partly cloudy. Not the kind of day when someone would expect sudden danger from the elements. If Joshua had set out for a walk in the woods, he would have been more than capable of handling it. He'd grown up in this environment, knew the trails, and wasn't the type to get lost easily. Which is why it was so strange that he never returned. When Joshua didn't come home by late afternoon, it wasn't immediately alarming. He was 18, an adult by law, and known for his independence. But by evening, his family began to feel the quiet shift into worry. Phone calls were made to friends. None had seen him since the day before. By the next morning, that worry had hardened into fear. His parents contacted police, and the official search began. Officers and volunteers scoured the wooded areas surrounding Woodland Park. They checked trails, creek beds, and abandoned sheds. Search dogs were brought in, but the dogs never picked up a scent that led to anything concrete. Some of Joshua's friends joined the search, hiking through dense brush and calling his name into the stillness. They found nothing. No footprints, no dropped belongings, no sign of a struggle. It was as if Joshua had walked out of town and vanished into thin air. From the very first day, people tried to piece together the puzzle. The voluntary disappearance theory. Some thought he had chosen to leave, maybe to start fresh somewhere else, maybe to chase a dream, maybe just to escape small-town life. But this idea didn't sit right with those who knew him best. He had left without money, without his guitar, without even telling close friends. The accident theory. Others believed he might have had an accident, fallen into a ravine, drowned in a stream, or gotten injured where no one could find him. But searches turned up no evidence. The foul play theory. There were also whispers, quiet, uneasy ones, that someone might have harmed him. But no one could think of a reason why or who it could have been. In the years after his disappearance, Small details would surface that made people wonder if Joshua's last walk had taken him somewhere specific. A few locals recalled that the abandoned cabin where he would later be found wasn't far from his usual wandering routes. It was the kind of place a curious person might try to explore. Had he gone there intentionally? If so, why? One chilling possibility is that Joshua might have been lured there. If someone had been inside the cabin that day, perhaps a squatter, perhaps someone he knew, they might have convinced him to come in. Or perhaps there had been an encounter gone wrong, one that ended with Joshua trapped in a place no one thought to check. But all of this is speculation. The truth of what happened after he left his house that morning is locked in silence. For Joshua's family, the days after his disappearance blurred together into one long stretch of waiting. The house was quiet without him. His guitar sat untouched in the corner. His room remained exactly as he'd left it, as though he might walk back in at any moment. Holidays came and went. His birthday passed each year with no celebration. The family never declared him dead, holding on to the fragile thread of hope that he might still be out there, somewhere. But in that small mountain town, the story of Joshua Maddux became one of those half-whispered mysteries people would talk about in hushed tones. A young man gone without a trace, a family left without answers, and a sense that the truth might be closer than anyone realized. In the first months after Joshua vanished, his name was still on everyone's lips. It was in the local newspaper, on bulletin boards, in whispered conversations between neighbors. People remembered what he'd been wearing the last time they saw him. They speculated about where he might have gone. They kept an eye out for any unfamiliar face in town, just in case it might be him returning. But time is relentless. Even the most urgent stories fade. By the end of the first year, Joshua's disappearance had shifted from a daily topic to an occasional one. The flyers that once clung to telephone poles had curled and yellowed under the mountain sun. Rain had smudged the ink on some, until his smile was nothing more than a faded blur. For his family, though, nothing had faded. The absence was constant. Every knock at the door could be him. Every phone call could be news. Every time the front gate squeaked, they looked up, expecting to see him walking up the path. It happened more than once. A friend of a friend claimed they had seen someone who looked just like Joshua in a town 2 hours away. Another person swore they'd passed him on the highway. There was even a rumor, unconfirmed but persistent, that he'd been spotted playing guitar on a street corner in Denver. Each time, the family would chase the lead. They'd make calls, drive long distances, show photos, ask questions. And each time, the result was the same. It wasn't him. False hope is its own kind of cruelty. It lifts you just high enough to believe, then drops you harder than before. By the second year, the case had gone cold. The Woodland Park Police Department kept Joshua's file open, but with no new evidence, it sat in a drawer most of the time. Officers would still respond to tips, but each one ended in the same dead end. Some in the community quietly questioned whether enough had been done early on. Could the search have been larger? Should the cabin where he was eventually found have been checked? At the time, no one had any reason to suspect it. It was private property, locked and boarded up, with no obvious signs of recent activity. Still, looking back, it's impossible not to wonder. If someone had gone inside in 2008, would they have found him then? By the time 3 years had gone by, Joshua's absence had become part of the town's background, like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. People still cared, but they no longer expected new developments. The Maddux family lived in a strange in-between place. They couldn't mourn him, not without proof. But they couldn't move forward either. His room stayed much the same. His belongings were left untouched. The guitar, the books, the worn sneakers by the bed. All of it was preserved, waiting for a return that never came. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving dinners where his chair sat empty. Christmas mornings where one fewer gift was placed under the tree. Birthdays where the cake was smaller and no candles were lit for him. Less than a mile away, the cabin stood silent. Seasons passed over it. Snow piling on the roof in winter, wildflowers sprouting at its base in summer. No one lived there. No one cared for it. Inside, the air grew thick with dust. Spiders spun webs across corners. The old furniture sat exactly where it had been abandoned years earlier. The breakfast bar blocking the fireplace remained in place, a quiet, unmoving barrier hiding the truth behind it. It's strange to think how close Joshua was to being found. Every time his family drove past that stretch of road, every time someone walked through those nearby woods, the answer was right there. Just a few feet away, separated by wood, stone, and 7 long years of silence. Even in the absence of evidence, people continued to tell their own versions of the story. Some insisted he had run away to start over. Others were certain he'd been murdered. A few whispered about the cabin, claiming it wasn't as empty as it seemed, that sometimes at night a dim light could be seen through the boards over the windows. Of course, most dismissed these as stories told for effect. But after 2015, when the truth came out, those same people would remember those whispers differently. By the summer of 2015, Joshua had been missing for 7 years. His case had faded from the news entirely. New families had moved into Woodland Park who had never even heard his name. For the Maddux family, the years had been a long, slow erosion of hope, leaving only a thin shell of it intact. No one knew that the truth was about to emerge. Not from a breakthrough investigation, not from a confession, but from something as mundane as a demolition order. The cabin had been marked for removal. After years of sitting empty, it was finally going to be torn down to make way for new construction. Workers arrived with tools, ready to dismantle it piece by piece. They started with the interior, moving old furniture out of the way, and then they reached the fireplace. They slid the heavy breakfast bar aside. It scraped across the dusty floorboards, revealing the dark mouth of the chimney behind it. At first, they thought they saw nothing unusual. But as one worker shone a flashlight upward into the flue, the beam caught something pale and curved. At first, it looked like stone. Then they realized what it was: a human bone. In that moment, 7 years of silence shattered. The cabin had been empty for so long that it almost seemed part of the landscape. Another piece of forgotten wood and stone slowly returning to the earth. But on that August day in 2015, it became the center of everything. The demolition crew arrived early, their trucks rumbling onto the overgrown driveway. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall pines, dappling the warped siding of the house. The air was still, heavy with the scent of resin and dust. Inside, the cabin was exactly what you would expect after more than a decade of abandonment. The floors creaked under every step. Cobwebs draped the corners like thin, ghostly curtains. The furniture was old but intact. A couch with faded upholstery. A table ringed with the stains of long-forgotten coffee mugs. The workers moved through the rooms, lifting chairs, stacking boxes, carrying the past out into the daylight. In the main room, near the center of the cabin, stood the fireplace, wide, built of stone, with a heavy wooden breakfast bar standing in front of it like a makeshift blockade. One of the crew members leaned into it, grunting as he pushed. The bar scraped across the dusty floorboards, leaving a pale mark where it had sat unmoved for years. Behind it, the dark opening of the fireplace yawned, its interior shadowed and silent. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. It was just an empty, soot-stained opening. But as the first worker crouched to look inside, something caught his eye. It was small, a pale shape against the darkness. At first, he thought it might be part of a bird's nest or a scrap of fabric. But as he leaned closer, shining a flashlight into the chimney, the light revealed the unmistakable curve of a human bone. He froze. The others noticed his stillness and came over, peering into the narrow space. What the flashlight beam showed next was something they would never forget. Curled in a fetal position, knees drawn to chest, was the skeletal form of a young man. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air in the cabin felt heavier, as if it, too, understood the gravity of what had just been uncovered. Finally, someone whispered the only words that made sense. "Call the police." The sound of the crew's radios and cell phones filled the cabin as they stepped back from the fireplace, keeping a respectful distance from what they now knew was a human body. Outside, the world went on as normal. Birds calling from the trees, the faint hum of traffic on a road not far away. But inside that cabin, time had stopped. When officers arrived, the first thing they did was secure the scene. Yellow tape was draped across the doorway. The crew members were asked to wait outside, their hands still carrying the fine white dust from the old floorboards. Investigators stepped into the dim main room, their flashlights sweeping over the fireplace. The body was wedged inside the chimney, feet down, head tilted toward the opening at the top. Bones pressed against the narrow flue walls, as though the space had slowly claimed them over the years. The position alone raised immediate questions. Why feet first? If this had been someone trying to enter from the roof, wouldn't they have gone in head first, able to control their descent? Feet first suggested either someone had been lowered in or had tried to back out, failing before they could escape. As the body was carefully removed, more unsettling details emerged. The young man was naked. His clothes were not with him in the chimney. They were folded neatly inside the cabin, close to the fireplace. The breakfast bar that had blocked the opening was heavy, far too awkward to move from inside the chimney. If it had been there at the time, then there was no way the person inside could have gotten out on their own. It was as though the cabin itself had conspired to keep him hidden. Once the remains were transported from the cabin, investigators began the process of identification. Dental records were checked against missing persons files. It didn't take long. 7 years earlier, an 18-year-old named Joshua Maddux had walked out of his home in Woodland Park and never returned. His description, his age, his build, his height matched perfectly. When the confirmation came back, the news spread quickly through town. For the Maddux family, the phone call ended 7 years of not knowing, and began a lifetime of different questions. It's impossible to imagine what it feels like to finally learn the location of someone you've searched for every day, only to realize they had been so close all along, less than a mile from the family home, hidden inside a chimney in a cabin they had driven past countless times. Joshua's parents expressed both relief and grief. Relief because they finally knew where he was. Grief because the reality was harder than the uncertainty had ever been. And confusion because nothing about the way he was found made sense. In a small community like Woodland Park, news travels fast. By the end of the day, almost everyone knew the broad strokes. Joshua Maddux had been found in an abandoned cabin's chimney. Theories began immediately. Some pointed to a tragic accident, perhaps a failed attempt to enter the cabin that ended in being trapped. Others were certain there had to be more to it, that someone had placed him there intentionally. And then there were those who simply shook their heads and said nothing, unsettled by the strangeness of it all. With the discovery, Joshua's case shifted from a missing persons file to a death investigation. Detectives reviewed every scrap of information from 2008. Interviews, search records, witness statements. They examined the cabin in detail, photographing every angle, every inch of the chimney. But time had taken its toll. Whatever physical evidence might once have existed was gone. The body showed no signs of trauma, no broken bones that could be linked to foul play. The cause of death remained undetermined. The chimney, the fireplace, the folded clothes, all of it formed a picture that was incomplete, a puzzle missing its most important pieces. After 7 years, he had been less than a mile from his family home the entire time, hidden in plain sight. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Why would Joshua have been in that chimney? And how had no one found him sooner? The cabin belonged to a man named Chuck Murphy, who had owned it for decades but left it vacant for years. Murphy told the police that the fireplace had been blocked by that breakfast bar for as long as he could remember, long before Joshua's disappearance. If that was true, then how had Joshua gotten inside? The official autopsy could not determine a cause of death. There were no signs of gunshot wounds, stabbing, or blunt force trauma. His bones bore no marks of violence. Toxicology results were inconclusive after so many years. What remained were theories. Some suggested it was a tragic accident, that Joshua had tried to enter the cabin by climbing down the chimney, perhaps as a prank or to seek shelter, and gotten stuck. Others believed there was more to the story, that someone had put him there intentionally, and the blocking of the fireplace was no coincidence. For Joshua's family, the discovery was both an answer and a new question. They finally knew where he was, but they still didn't know why. And for Woodland Park, the mystery of the boy in the chimney was just beginning. The cabin where Joshua was found wasn't just any building in Woodland Park. For decades, it had stood quietly at the edge of town, surrounded by tall pines and half hidden from the road. To some, it was nothing more than a piece of old property left to decay. To others, it carried a certain air of unease, the kind of place children dared each other to get close to, but rarely stepped inside. It was built in the mid-20th century, a small two-story wooden structure with a stone chimney running down one side. At one time, it had been a cheerful vacation home, the kind of place where families came for the weekend to escape the city, breathing in the crisp mountain air and listening to the crackle of a fire in the hearth. But as the years went on, the family who owned it stopped visiting. Eventually, it was left in the care of a man named Chuck Murphy. Murphy had his own home in the area, and for reasons that were never entirely clear to outsiders, he left the cabin empty for years. Some say it was due to disputes over property use. Others claim it simply fell into disrepair and wasn't worth fixing up. By the early 2000s, the once welcoming cabin was already falling apart. Broken windows, rotten wood, and furniture still sitting exactly where it had been decades earlier, gathering layers of dust. The chimney, like the rest of the cabin, had not been used for a very long time. Murphy later said that he'd placed a heavy wooden breakfast bar in front of the fireplace to block cold air and animals from getting in. That breakfast bar, he claimed, had been there for years before Joshua's disappearance. If this was true, it made the discovery in 2015 all the more confusing. Locals had their own stories about the cabin. Some said they'd heard strange noises when passing by at night. The sound of something moving inside, even though it was supposed to be empty. Others said they'd seen light flicker through the cracks in the boarded windows. Most of these tales were shrugged off as the product of teenage imaginations, the kind of ghost stories small towns invent for the thrill of it. But after Joshua's body was found there, those old stories didn't seem so easy to dismiss. One detail especially unsettled people. When the demolition crew discovered the remains, Joshua's clothing wasn't on his body. His jeans and shirt were found inside the cabin, neatly placed near the fireplace. This raised troubling questions. If Joshua had somehow climbed into the chimney himself, whether from the roof or from inside the cabin, why would he remove his clothes? And if he had entered from the top, why had he gone down feet first? Most people attempting to enter a chimney from above go down head first to control their descent. Feet first suggests something else entirely, that he might have been lowered in or tried to back out of it. Investigators tried to reconstruct the possibilities. The simplest explanation was that Joshua had been trying to get into the cabin for shelter. Maybe it was cold that night. Maybe the door was locked. Perhaps he thought the chimney was wide enough to slide through. If he got stuck, hypothermia could have set in quickly, leaving him unable to call for help. But this theory didn't explain the furniture blocking the fireplace, or why his clothes were inside the cabin instead of on his body. Some locals suspected someone had put Joshua in that chimney, either after killing him or to hide his body. If this was the case, it would explain the awkward feet-first position and the blocked fireplace. But it raised even darker questions. Who in Woodland Park would have done something like this, and why? And if it had been murder, why were there no signs of trauma on his bones? Could he have been incapacitated in a way that left no marks? Or had his cause of death simply left no trace after so many years? There were whispers, never loud enough to make the newspapers but persistent, that Joshua's death might have been connected to something more unusual. Some people remembered hearing about squatters who had used the cabin in the past. Others spoke of drifters passing through town. And there were a few who hinted at more unsettling ideas. That Joshua might have stumbled into something that frightened him, or someone badly enough to end his life in such a strange place. As police tried to piece together the events of May 2008, they faced one huge obstacle: the passage of time. 7 years in the elements had reduced Joshua's remains to little more than bones, and whatever clues had once been there were now gone. The cabin itself, too, had been weathered by the years. Warped wood, fallen plaster, rusted nails. Even the dust felt ancient, as if the place had been holding its breath since the day he disappeared. The owner of the cabin, Chuck Murphy, was cooperative in interviews but admitted he had no idea how Joshua could have gotten in. He insisted that the breakfast bar had been in front of the fireplace for a long time, possibly even before Josh vanished. That detail alone baffled investigators. If the fireplace had been blocked for years, then Joshua could not have entered from inside the cabin, which meant he must have come from the roof, somehow past the blockage. No theory fit perfectly. Meanwhile, Joshua's family struggled to make peace with the discovery. For them, the years of uncertainty had ended, but they had been replaced by a different kind of torment. The knowledge that he had been so close to home all along. That, for 7 years, they had walked the same streets, breathed the same air, never realizing that the answer to their search was hidden inside a chimney just a short distance away. The cabin was torn down not long after the discovery. The land where it stood became just another quiet corner of Woodland Park, the kind of place you might drive past without a second thought. But for those who knew the story, it was not just a patch of ground. It was the site of one of the strangest and most haunting mysteries the town had ever seen. And as the dust settled, both literally and figuratively, one question remained louder than the rest. If the truth of Joshua's death was hidden in that cabin, had it been destroyed with it? When the yellow tape went up around the cabin, it wasn't just a crime scene. It was a doorway into 7 years of unanswered questions. The discovery of Joshua Maddux's remains had jolted Woodland Park into sudden, uneasy attention. But for investigators, the work was only beginning. The cabin had been sealed to everyone except police and forensic specialists. Outside, the demolition crew waited, their tools idle, their earlier chatter replaced by a heavy silence. Inside, every inch of the main room was examined, photographed, and catalogued. The air smelled of dust and the faint, metallic tang that comes with old nails and stone. The chimney itself became the center of focus. Built from thick, uneven stones, it rose straight through the heart of the cabin, its narrow flue coated in decades of soot. From the outside, it looked sturdy. From the inside, it was little more than a vertical tunnel, barely wide enough for a grown man to fit through without twisting his shoulders. The first thing investigators did was measure the opening. It was shockingly tight, around 14 inches across at its narrowest. A person entering it would have had to squeeze, pressing arms against sides, knees bent awkwardly. This alone made the idea of an accidental entry seem strange. They then measured the distance from the top of the chimney to the fireplace opening. The drop was long enough to make descent difficult without assistance, especially if someone entered feet first. The breakfast bar blocking the fireplace was not just heavy, it was wide, awkward, and positioned in a way that would have made moving it from inside almost impossible. Whoever had placed it there had done so from within the room. If it was already in place when Joshua entered the chimney, then he was trapped the moment he slid down. That left only 2 options. He entered the chimney before the bar was placed, meaning someone else sealed the fireplace afterward. Or the bar was moved at some point after his death and replaced exactly where it had been, undisturbed for years. Either scenario raised disturbing possibilities. Joshua's clothes were another puzzle. His jeans and shirt were found inside the cabin, folded neatly near the fireplace. There were no signs of rips or damage that might indicate a struggle. Why would he remove them before climbing into a chimney? Some suggested disorientation from cold or injury, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing in cases of hypothermia. But the conditions in early May weren't cold enough to make that seem likely. Others thought it was deliberate. Either he chose to remove them for an unknown reason, or someone else removed them after the fact. The next step was to examine how he might have gotten into the chimney at all. The roof of the cabin was still intact, though weather-worn. Investigators climbed up to inspect the chimney cap. There was no cap in place, just an open mouth leading straight down. From above, the flue looked even narrower. A person could slide in, but the descent would be slow and awkward, especially feet first. Some officers tried to imagine the scene. Did he climb up to the roof willingly? Was he forced at gunpoint or by threat? Or did he, in some strange moment of curiosity or confusion, choose to go down himself? None of the scenarios fit neatly. After 7 years, there was no soft tissue left, only bones, brittle from time. The position was telling. Knees bent, arms close, head tilted slightly forward. It looked like a position of confinement, not free movement. There were no fractures suggesting a fall from height. No signs of blunt force trauma. No evidence of sharp injuries. The lack of obvious cause of death frustrated the investigators. Without tissue, toxicology tests were nearly useless. When questioned, cabin owner Chuck Murphy repeated the same story. The breakfast bar had been in front of the fireplace for years, possibly even before 2008. He had not been in the cabin in a long time. He had no idea how Joshua could have ended up inside. Murphy's statement raised as many questions as it answered. If the bar had truly been there for that long, then how did Joshua get into the chimney at all? If he entered from the roof, why was his clothing inside the cabin? The contradictions began to pile up. By the end of the first week of investigation, the official line was that Joshua's death appeared unusual, but showed no signs of obvious foul play. This was small comfort to his family, who had waited 7 years for answers only to be handed more confusion. Police kept the case open, but privately, some officers admitted they were running into a wall. Every physical clue could be interpreted 2 different ways, and the years had erased whatever invisible traces might have told the real story. What remained was a mystery locked in stone and soot, one that had waited patiently for 7 years to be found, and might wait forever to be understood. When Joshua's remains were first identified, some investigators, and a fair number of locals, leaned toward the simplest explanation, that what happened to him was a tragic accident. No conspiracy, no violence, just a young man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The theory went something like this. On that day in May 2008, Joshua might have been walking through town or the nearby woods when he came across the abandoned cabin. Maybe he'd been there before. Maybe he was just curious. Either way, he decided to explore. Finding the doors locked or blocked, he might have climbed onto the roof to look for another way in. The chimney, with its open top, might have seemed like an option. Step by step, how it could have happened. Approaching the cabin, Joshua sees the building standing quiet under the pines. Its siding is weathered, its windows boarded, but the structure still stands solid. From ground level, there's no easy way in. The front door is secured. The windows are nailed shut. Maybe he used an old wood pile, or leaned against a low branch to reach the edge of the roof. It wouldn't have been hard for someone his age and fitness. From the roof, the chimney's open mouth might have looked like a potential entrance, a straight drop to the main room below. If Joshua thought the flue was wide enough, he might have believed he could slide down into the cabin. For reasons unknown, perhaps to control his drop or avoid hitting his head, he lowers himself feet first into the chimney. At first, it's doable. The stone walls are rough enough to brace against. He might have thought he could manage the descent in short bursts, lowering himself little by little. Somewhere along the way, the space narrows. The flue is only about 14 inches across at its tightest point. His shoulders wedge against the stone. He tries to shift, but his knees are bent awkwardly and his arms pinned to his sides. The more he moves, the more firmly he's stuck. Panic sets in. His voice echoes uselessly up the chimney. The sound is swallowed by stone and soot. He struggles, but the narrowness and the angle make it impossible to reverse his position. Hours pass. Without food, water, or a way out, exhaustion takes over. Alone in the dark, he slips into unconsciousness and never wakes up. At first glance, the accident theory has an undeniable simplicity. It doesn't require imagining complex motives or hidden actors. It's easy to picture a curious teenager making a bad decision while exploring a boarded-up building. It also explains why there were no signs of trauma on his bones, no gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no blunt force fractures. If he died of exhaustion, dehydration, or even positional asphyxiation, unable to breathe due to the position of his body, those causes might leave no lasting trace after 7 years. But as investigators, and later online researchers, looked closer, the theory began to fray at the edges. 1. The breakfast bar. The heaviest blow to the accident theory was the breakfast bar blocking the fireplace. If Joshua slid down the chimney, he would have landed in the fireplace opening. But the bar was too large and heavy to move from inside the chimney. If it was in place at the time, it meant someone must have moved it after he entered, and then put it back. 2. The clothing. His clothes were inside the cabin, neatly folded, not torn or discarded haphazardly. If he entered from the roof, how did his clothes end up inside? And why would he remove them before climbing into such a tight, rough space? 3. The feet-first position. Most people attempting to descend a chimney choose a head-first position so they can control their movements and see where they're going. Feet-first entry is unusual unless someone is being lowered or is attempting to back out. 4. Lack of soot or signs of struggle. Given the chimney's narrowness, one might expect scratches on the stone or other indicators of frantic movement. After 7 years, most small traces could be gone, but investigators noted no obvious signs that someone had thrashed violently to free themselves. In the end, the official stance was cautious. The accident theory couldn't be ruled out, but it also couldn't explain every detail. It was the most straightforward option, but it left too many loose threads hanging in the air. For some, that was enough to keep it in the realm of possibility. For others, it was exactly those unanswered questions that made them look elsewhere for the truth. If the accident theory was the simplest explanation, the foul play theory was the one that made people uneasy. not because it was the most likely, but because it meant that someone, somewhere, might know exactly what happened to Joshua Maddux, and had stayed silent for years. It starts with a question. If Joshua didn't enter that chimney on his own, then who put him there? In this version, Joshua either encountered someone he knew or crossed paths with a stranger who brought him to the cabin. Whether by threat, physical force, or deception, he ended up inside that chimney against his will. From there, two possibilities arise. 1. He was already dead or unconscious when placed inside. 2. He was alive but trapped intentionally, left to die. Step-by-step scenario. Joshua leaves home that morning in May 2008. Somewhere along his walk, he meets someone. Maybe a friend, maybe an acquaintance, maybe a stranger. They end up at the abandoned cabin. Perhaps Joshua was lured there under a harmless pretense, to hang out, explore, or retrieve something. Or perhaps he was forced there by intimidation or violence. Once inside, something happens. An argument, a confrontation, a moment of panic. Joshua is placed in the chimney feet first. If he was alive, the narrowness would have trapped him almost immediately. If he was unconscious or deceased, the chimney would have served as a hidden place to dispose of a body. Afterwards, the breakfast bar is placed in front of the fireplace. Whether it was already there or moved into place after he was inside, the result is the same. The opening is sealed. His clothing, neatly folded, is left near the fireplace. Why? If foul play was involved, this could have been staged to create confusion or remove identifying items from the body. The breakfast bar is the strongest piece of evidence pointing away from an accident. If the fireplace was blocked from the inside, Joshua could not have gotten in or out without help. If Joshua had entered from the roof, his clothing wouldn't have ended up neatly folded inside the cabin. This detail suggests that someone else was in that room. Feet-first descent is consistent with someone being lowered into a space rather than voluntarily climbing in. The cabin was abandoned and in disrepair, the kind of place where someone could act without fear of being seen. This is where the foul play theory becomes harder to pin down. Joshua was well-liked, with no known enemies and no signs of involvement in dangerous activities. Theories about motive range widely. Personal conflict, an argument with someone he knew. Robbery gone wrong. Though nothing obvious was taken, some speculate he interrupted someone at the cabin. Random violence, the work of a drifter, squatter, or someone passing through town. Cover-up, an accidental death that someone panicked and tried to conceal. There are whispers, quiet, almost reluctant, about a man who once lived in Woodland Park, a man who left town not long after Joshua vanished. Nothing ever came of these whispers officially. No charges, no public accusation. But the timing, for some, was suspicious enough to keep the theory alive. For all its unsettling implications, the foul play theory has one major weakness: evidence. After 7 years, whatever trace evidence might have existed was gone. No fingerprints, no DNA, no tool marks that could definitively link another person to Joshua's death. Without that, suspicion remains just that. Suspicion. In the end, the foul play theory refuses to die because it explains details the accident theory cannot. But it also demands a truth that may never surface. If someone put Joshua in that chimney, they've managed to keep their secret for more than a decade. When a case resists every logical explanation, people often turn toward the less logical ones. Joshua Maddux's death, with its chimney, its folded clothing, its blocked fireplace, invited more than just two competing ideas of accident or foul play. It opened the door to something stranger. In Woodland Park, these theories were rarely spoken aloud in the open. They surfaced late at night, over quiet conversations, or in the corners of internet forums, where the line between fact and speculation blurs. Some believed that the cabin had not been entirely abandoned. They suggested that someone, perhaps a drifter, perhaps a local with nowhere else to stay, had been living there quietly. In this version, Joshua stumbled upon the cabin during one of his walks. Maybe he intended to explore. Maybe he intended to rest. But inside, he encountered someone who didn't want to be found. The theory goes that this person trapped Joshua in the chimney, either in a moment of violence or to silence him, and then vanished without a trace. Supporters of this theory point to the folded clothing. If Joshua entered from the roof on his own, how did his clothes end up inside? If someone was already in the cabin, they could have taken them off him before forcing him into the chimney. The weakness of this theory is the complete lack of signs that anyone lived in the cabin. No fresh trash, no bedding, no recent supplies. But then again, 7 years is a long time to erase such traces. There is a darker, more unsettling idea that Joshua's death was the result of a cruel dare or initiation, something meant to frighten but not kill. Some point to the cabin's location and its history of attracting adventurous teenagers as a place for dares. In this telling, Joshua might have been convinced to enter the chimney as part of a challenge, with others promising to help him out afterward. Something went wrong. The situation turned fatal, and panic set in. The participants could have fled, leaving Joshua trapped. The breakfast bar could have been placed in front of the fireplace either as a misguided way to hide the accident or to avoid discovery. The problem here is that no one ever came forward. In small towns, secrets that involve multiple people have a way of leaking, but this one never has. The ritual theory. This is the theory most people dismiss, but it lingers in the background because of how unsettling the circumstances were. Some locals noted the unusual neatness of the folded clothes and the way the body was concealed. They connected it, however loosely, to the idea of an intentional placement. Something done not just to hide Joshua, but as part of a symbolic act. Those who believe this theory point to the lack of apparent motive in both the accident and foul play explanations. They see the cabin and chimney as chosen deliberately. Of course, no evidence supports this idea. It remains firmly in the realm of speculation, fueled mostly by the eerie imagery of the scene itself. There is one more theory, a hybrid between foul play and accident. It suggests Joshua may have been with someone that day willingly, perhaps a friend or acquaintance. They could have been exploring the cabin together. Joshua tries to enter the chimney, becomes stuck, and calls for help. The other person panics, afraid of trespassing charges or of being blamed for what happened. Instead of seeking help, they leave. Hours or days later, someone else, or perhaps the same person, moves the breakfast bar in front of the fireplace, either to cover up what happened or to keep animals out, never realizing what they were truly sealing inside. This theory explains the lack of outward violence while still involving another person. But without a witness, it remains speculation. None of these stranger theories are officially recognized. The police, bound by evidence, can't work from whispers alone. But in a case where nothing fits neatly, these ideas persist because they keep one truth alive. Joshua's death is not just about the chimney. It's about the moments before. The choices, his or someone else's, that led him there. When Joshua's body was found in the chimney, investigators quickly turned their attention to the cabin's history and to the people who had owned, visited, or had access to it over the years. At the center of this was Chuck Murphy, the man who owned the property. Murphy was a longtime resident of Woodland Park, known for owning several properties in the area. The cabin, however, was not one he lived in. It had belonged to his family for decades, but had been left unused for many years before Joshua's disappearance. When questioned, Murphy told police he hadn't been inside the cabin in a long time. He claimed the building had fallen into such disrepair that it wasn't worth maintaining, and so it had simply been left to stand as it was. But the detail that drew the most attention was his statement about the breakfast bar in front of the fireplace. Murphy said that piece of furniture had been there for years, possibly even before 2008. He remembered placing it there himself to block drafts from the unused chimney. If this was true, it raised the uncomfortable question: how could Joshua have gotten into the chimney from above without disturbing the bar below? The cabin was not in an isolated wilderness. It sat on a piece of private land, but not far from the road, and anyone willing to ignore no trespassing signs could have reached it without much difficulty. The locks on the doors and windows were old, but not impossible to bypass. And according to some locals, kids and teenagers had been sneaking into the cabin for years to hang out or dare each other to explore. Police asked Murphy whether anyone else had keys. He admitted there might have been old copies in the family, but he didn't think anyone had used them in a long time. Still, in a small town, word spreads about places like this, and an abandoned cabin often draws the curious. One neighbor, who lived down the road, remembered seeing people near the cabin in the years before Joshua was found. They recalled cars occasionally pulling into the overgrown driveway and staying for a while. Sometimes the visitors were teenagers. Other times they were older men they didn't recognize. When asked whether these visits lined up with the time Joshua disappeared, the neighbor wasn't sure. It was all too long ago to pinpoint exact dates. In the aftermath of the discovery, whispers spread through town that someone in Murphy's extended family might have been in the cabin during the time Joshua went missing. There was no evidence for this, just the way rumors grow when unanswered questions remain. Still, the idea persisted. If someone with access to the cabin had been there in 2008, perhaps they knew more than they had told police. Chuck Murphy passed away in 2018, 3 years after Joshua was found. In interviews before his death, he maintained that he had no knowledge of how Joshua got into the chimney. He said the discovery haunted him, that he thought about it often, wondering if something had happened on his property without him ever realizing it. With Murphy gone, one potential source of answers was gone too. If he knew more than he had shared, that knowledge is now buried with him. The investigation into people connected to the cabin ended without concrete results. There were too many years between Joshua's disappearance and the discovery of his body. Too many gaps in memory. Too many chances for stories to fade or change. What remained was a web of could-haves. The owner who never went inside. Visitors no one could identify. Keys that might have been in unknown hands. Each thread hinted at a path toward the truth, but none of them led all the way there. Before it became the center of one of Woodland Park's strangest mysteries, the cabin was simply part of the town's quiet scenery, a place that, for decades, existed without drawing much attention. It had been built in the mid-20th century, a small 2-story wooden retreat with a stone chimney running straight down one side. At the time, Woodland Park was still a sleepy mountain community. Families came here for weekends or summers, escaping the noise and heat of Colorado Springs. The cabin had a simple design. A main room with a fireplace. A small kitchen with a window that looked toward the pines. 2 upstairs bedrooms under a sloped roof. In its early years, the cabin was lively. It was filled with the sound of children running through the rooms, the smell of pine logs burning in the fireplace, the laughter of late-night card games. But over time, those visits grew less frequent. By the 1980s, the family who owned it began to visit less. The younger generation moved away, and the property slowly slipped into neglect. By the 1990s, the cabin was mostly empty year-round. The wood began to weather, the paint faded, and the once welcoming porch sagged under the weight of too many winters. The owner at the time, Chuck Murphy, kept the title but not the upkeep. He didn't rent it out. He didn't renovate it. He simply let it stand. When a building sits empty for long enough, it gathers a reputation. And the cabin was no exception. Kids dared each other to go inside, trading stories about creaks and shadows. Some claimed they'd seen light flickering through the cracks in the boarded windows, though no one lived there. Others said the air inside was always colder than outside, even in summer. Whether those were just ghost stories or exaggerated memories didn't matter. They made the cabin a point of curiosity, especially for adventurous teenagers. One detail that had been part of the cabin for years before Joshua vanished was the breakfast bar in front of the fireplace. Murphy said it was placed there to keep cold air from blowing in, and to stop raccoons or stray cats from nesting in the flue. This piece of furniture became one of the most puzzling elements of Joshua's case. If it had truly been in place for years, it should have made entry through the chimney impossible. Or at least obvious if it had been moved. Although officially empty, the cabin wasn't untouched. Over the years, signs of intrusion appeared. A broken window here, muddy footprints there, empty beer bottles on the floor. Someone, at some point, had been inside, but nothing was ever reported stolen. Whatever drew people to the cabin, it wasn't for valuables. It was for the thrill of stepping into a forgotten space. In the years immediately before Joshua's disappearance, the cabin was already falling apart. Shingles were missing from the roof. A tree branch had scraped against the siding so long it left a pale scar in the wood. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, and the only signs of recent disturbance were the occasional footprints of animals that had found their way in. No one could have guessed then that the building, just another relic of the past, would one day be the site of a mystery that would outlive it. In 2015, after Joshua's body was discovered, the cabin's fate was sealed. It was torn down not long afterward, leaving behind nothing but bare ground and a few stones from the foundation. Today, if you stand where it once stood, you'll see only trees and grass reclaiming the space. The chimney is gone. The fireplace is gone. And with them, perhaps, went the last tangible clues to what happened inside. For 7 years, the Maddux family lived in a space between hope and grief. Every day without Joshua was a day without an answer, but also a day when the possibility, however slim, remained that he might walk through their door again. That possibility ended with a phone call in 2015. When the police contacted the family to tell them that human remains had been found in an abandoned cabin less than a mile from their home, they didn't want to believe it was Joshua. The distance alone made it hard to accept. How could he have been so close all this time, hidden in a place they had passed so many times before? But when dental records confirmed it, there was no more room for doubt. The news brought with it a complex knot of emotions. Relief that they finally knew where he was. Grief, sharper than before because it was no longer abstract. Confusion, because the circumstances made no sense. For Joshua's parents, the discovery didn't bring closure. In interviews, his father explained that knowing where Joshua had been all along only deepened the pain. How could we have missed him? Was a question they couldn't shake. The odd details, the chimney, the folded clothes, the breakfast bar, weren't just strange facts for them. They were painful reminders that his final moments were spent in a way no one could explain. The family spoke often about Joshua as a person, not just as the subject of a mystery. They remembered his love of music, his habit of carrying his guitar into the yard to play in the evenings. They remembered his easygoing nature, his kindness, and the way he treated people without judgment. Old photographs began to circulate online. Joshua, with a soft smile, long hair brushing his shoulders, sometimes holding his guitar, sometimes walking with friends. In each one, he looked like someone with a whole life ahead of him. Years before Joshua disappeared, his older brother had passed away. That loss had shaped the family's life long before this new tragedy. For Joshua's parents, losing another son, and in such a bewildering way, was a pain layered on pain. Friends of the family said that grief seemed to settle into the house itself. Yet, despite everything, they kept Joshua's room much the same. His guitar remained where he had last left it. His belongings stayed in place, as though he might return to pick them up. In the years since the discovery, the Maddux family has occasionally spoken to journalists and investigators. They've made it clear that they don't accept the idea that Joshua's death was a simple accident. They've asked for anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. But so far, no one has brought them the answers they need. For them, the case remains open, not in the files of the police department, but in their hearts. They know where Joshua is buried, but they do not know the truth of how he got there. And in that way, their story mirrors the experience of many families of the missing. The location of a body is not the same as the end of the mystery. When news broke in 2015 that the remains found in the abandoned cabin's chimney belonged to Joshua Maddux, Woodland Park felt the impact first. But it didn't take long for the story to spread far beyond the mountain town. Local headlines were soon followed by regional ones, and then national outlets picked it up. The headline was as strange as it was tragic. Missing teen found dead in chimney, 7 years later. It was the kind of story that seemed almost impossible to believe, the kind that made readers pause mid-scroll. The media's focus. Most articles led with the most bizarre details. The chimney, the folded clothes, the breakfast bar blocking the fireplace. These details were impossible to ignore, and they gave the story an almost surreal quality. For some, it felt like something out of a novel or a horror film. But this was real. Journalists interviewed the family, local police, and Chuck Murphy, the cabin's owner. Each interview added more facts, but also more contradictions. Some reports emphasized the accident theory, painting Joshua's death as a tragic miscalculation during a moment of exploration. Others leaned into the mystery, highlighting the details that didn't fit that narrative. As the story spread online, it took on a life of its own. On Reddit, true crime forums, and YouTube comment sections, people dissected every available detail. They mapped the cabin. They speculated about entry angles, time of death, and possible suspects. Some users focused on the physical realities, measuring chimney widths, debating whether someone could survive stuck for hours. Others searched for old police reports, property records, and even satellite images of the cabin before demolition. A few claimed to have grown up in Woodland Park and offered local rumors about the cabin's reputation, about strangers passing through town in 2008. about people who left abruptly after Joshua disappeared. The reason the story gained so much traction wasn't just its unusual details. It was the combination of factors. A young man, well-liked, with no known enemies. A location so close to home that it seemed impossible it hadn't been searched. A method of death that defied easy explanation. It became one of those cases people would mention when talking about strangest unsolved mysteries. The media attention also reignited every possible theory. Some outlets reprinted the foul play theory, citing the breakfast bar and clothing. Others dismissed it as sensationalism and stood by the accident explanation. But the more the story was told, the less certain anyone seemed to be. Each article or video added another layer of speculation. Like all news stories, it eventually faded from major outlets. But online, it never really went away. People still revisit it in true crime podcasts, YouTube documentaries, and late-night forum threads. For some, it's a puzzle they can't stop trying to solve. For others, it's a cautionary tale about how easily answers can be lost to time. And for the people of Woodland Park, it remains a story they carry, one that changed the way they see an ordinary cabin on the edge of town. 7 years missing. 7 years of not knowing. And then a discovery that answered one question but left a dozen more. Joshua Maddux's body was found. That much is certain. But how he came to be inside that narrow chimney, less than a mile from his home, remains a mystery that resists every neat explanation. We know he left home on May 8th, 2008, without telling anyone where he was going. We know the weather was mild, and he was dressed for a simple walk. We know he was found in a fetal position, feet first, inside a chimney blocked by a heavy breakfast bar. We know his clothes were folded inside the cabin, close to the fireplace. And we know there were no signs of injury, no evidence of a struggle, no definitive cause of death. Everything beyond that is uncertain. The theories revisited. The accident theory says Joshua climbed in himself and became trapped. The foul play theory says someone put him there. The stranger theories speak of squatters, dares, rituals, or panicked friends. Each has pieces that fit, but none complete the picture. Why feet first? Why were his clothes folded? Why did no one hear him in a town so small and so close? And perhaps the hardest question of all, how could he have been there for 7 years without anyone finding him? The place that held the secret is gone now, demolished, cleared, erased from the land. The stones of the chimney are scattered. The floorboards where the breakfast bar stood are gone. Whatever whispers the building might have carried went with it into the dust. For the people of Woodland Park, the story lingers. Some avoid the topic entirely. Others can't help but bring it up whenever the conversation turns to strange happenings. For Joshua's family, it's not just a story, it's a hole in their lives. They live with the ache of absence, the weight of uncertainty, and the quiet hope. Not for Joshua's return, but for the truth, however painful it might be. And so we are left here, where answers fade and questions remain. A young man, full of music and curiosity, set out for a walk one spring morning and never came back. Years later, he was found in the unlikeliest of places, close enough to touch the edges of home. What happened between those two moments may never be known. You are listening to Sleeping Radio, where stories end as quietly as they begin, and where sometimes the silence says more than the words ever could.